topic is carbon capture in Minnesota, public lands, fast money, and pipe dreams. This is a vast topic. So the only way to narrow it down a little bit is to talk about what's going on in the state of Minnesota. I will try to be somewhat comprehensive, but it is a vast topic. So I had to leave some stuff out. Cure, if you're not familiar with us, we've existed for about 30 years, and our origin is in clean water in the southwest part of the state. We are a rural environmental organization focusing on energy democracy and community resilience. And if you can go to the next slide, I like to think of it as the nonprofit formerly known as Clean Up the River Environment. We still do work on clean water things, of course, but we have a very big focus on energy projects and clean energy. So we are now go by Cure rather than the full longer name. Next slide. I'm going to try to cover a lot in our short time together today, and we'll see how far we can get in this. First, I'd like to talk about what do we even mean by carbon capture and sequestration. Then I'll be moving on to what some of the proposed for new technology in Minnesota are, and these are funded through your tax dollars through the Department of Energy grants. Then I will be talking about what the proposal of the oil and pipeline industry is in this space, which we are funding with our taxpayer dollars through clean fuel standard incentives. That will also overlap a bit with a proposal by the U.S. Forest Service, which I will mention and discuss a bit, to open up our national forests to this industry. Then finally, we'll bring it back to Aiken County and Talon to talk about what the mining industry is working on in this space, the funding that we're providing them as taxpayers through the Department of Energy, and also how this might be impacted by the Forest Service's proposal to open up its lands to carbon capture and sequestration. Hopefully we can get through all of that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, what is carbon capture and sequestration? It is many things to many people. First of all, on the moral upstanding side, a lot of people view it as a useful or even necessary climate change mitigation technique. Capturing CO2 emissions from burning things, either directly from a pollution source's smokestack or from the atmosphere itself, and converting it into another form of carbon to store it outside of the atmosphere is what the general term carbon capture means, and that's what sequestration is as well. You're taking carbon out of air emissions, out of the ambient air, and you are turning it into a rock, you are turning it into a liquid, you are turning it into a concentrated gas and trying to find a place to stick it so that it doesn't come back into the atmosphere. Because as you all may know, we put entirely too much carbon in the atmosphere already, and it's a huge problem. To the bullets I have here, trees already do this for free. So, if you're against all carbon capture and sequestration, I'm sad to say that nature actually does it quite well. So there's a certain amount of background carbon capture going on at all times, and it's something that we can encourage. Wetlands, more specifically to Aiken County, wetlands are slower at capturing carbon, but they do a much better job than trees do. They store thousands and thousands of years of captured carbon as opposed to hundreds and hundreds of years, as you can see in this white pine. So don't count any wetlands out when you're thinking about this. And then the last one is a rhetorical question. Do we think that humans can do better than natural carbon sequestration? And for a lot of people, the answer is yes. Let's go to the next slide. So to other people, what is carbon capture and sequestration? It means money, and a lot of it. We will be talking about direct grants that these companies are getting from the federal government and the investment from private equity and the tech industry. We'll be talking about tax incentives, which we've had since 2008, that have also been recently increased for burying tons of CO2 deep underground. They pay a certain amount of money for pushing carbon underground to get oil out, or what's called enhanced oil recovery. They pay a little bit more to store CO2 from smokestacks and not get oil out. And then they pay even more to push the carbon underground if it has not been captured from a smokestack, but instead has been captured from the ambient air. So this gets very complicated very fast, but let's just say it's a lot of money on a per ton basis to push carbon deep underground. And then also there's, that was federal incentives. There are also state incentives like California's low carbon fuel standard, which has been adopted by other states as well. That is a big boost for this industry and allows them to access money that they wouldn't otherwise get. And then even without our taxpayer funded incentives, private companies, when they say that they are net zero, they mean that they are buying carbon credits from other companies that are claiming to capture the carbon. So that money is coming from big companies whose services you use, their money is money they got from you. That is a major funding source for this new industry. Next slide, please. And then finally, for a lot of people, carbon capture and sequestration, as it's currently proposed in practice today, is a false climate solution. That is to say that if you do carbon capture wrong, like doing too much of it on the wrong industries instead of just cleaning up or getting rid of those industries, this technology will take all of our financial resources and all of our time and not actually do anything to stop climate change. Most carbon capture projects proposed right now are meant to keep running heavy polluting industry where there are better options. So for example, instead of putting carbon capture on a coal plant, close the coal plant. Instead of putting carbon capture on ethanol, move towards electric transportation and mass transit. So a lot of these projects are proposed by very big incumbent industries in order to keep themselves running as they have. And we simply don't have enough money or time to waste on doing that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cover 3 things that are happening in Minnesota, broadly speaking. First, fun little startups that are trying to come up with new ways to capture carbon. The current biggest industry proposal, which is from the oil and gas industry and friends. And then finally, industry research, which is where I'll be able to talk a little bit about Talon's funding and efforts here. So next slide. So currently in Minnesota, there are startups and companies that are trying their darndest to figure out new ways to get carbon out of the air and put it into other stuff. So for example, the Department of Energy recently has announced that it's funding this company in Northfield to remove CO2 through enhanced carbon mineralization of steel slag aggregates in gravel roads. It'll be 8,108 carbon dioxide removal credits to DOE over the prize period. So a few things to note there. Steel slag aggregates, we're not talking about happy-go-lucky, people in their driveways and garages coming up with ways to just innocuously do this. They are working with heavy industry. They are working with sometimes toxic technologies that maybe this will capture carbon, but when you're dealing with heavy metals and other things like that, you have to watch out for the fact that one person's carbon capture might be another person's water pollution. This one relies on steel slag aggregates in gravel roads. I mean, as a rural Minnesotan, I'll let you know, we don't have unlimited gravel roads. And the fact that they are giving them 8,000 carbon dioxide removal credits, it doesn't say this here, but I assume that that means 8,000 tons of CO2, which sounds like a lot. But when you're comparing it to the scale of the problem, it's a good start for research, and it's not necessarily a technology that will scale. Next slide, please. Another example of this is a recent article about the biochar king of Minneapolis. So Minneapolis, the city, is investing in this idea of biochar, which is taking carbon that's been captured by trees, by wood, and then converting it into a low value type of coal. So you burn it in a specific way and you create biochar, which is more stable than just allowing wood to rot or something like that. If you want to fall down a rabbit hole, go read about biochar. It's apparently going to save everyone from everything, and it's a hell of a technology. But next slide, please. It doesn't really capture very much carbon. So from this article, the climate benefits will be likely to be minimal. The city couldn't provide me with an estimate, but a story about the project from last year noted that the city anticipated having a system that could handle 3,600 tons of wood waste per year, resulting in an estimated 1,500 tons of CO2 removed. That's about 0.04 of the city's current annual emissions. So, 1,500 tons sounds cool, but you got to compare it against a baseline. And so I'm not saying that biochar is pointless. I'm just saying it's not much of a carbon capture solution. And I am happy to discuss this with you at a later date. Next slide, please. So what is proposed by the industry, on the other hand, is gigantic, and it is a known technology that we've been doing since at least the 1980s. And this fun little graphic, which I did not make, sort of explains it. So the idea is you go to places that have smokestacks, either places that are burning natural gas, or they're creating hydrogen and that has CO2 as a byproduct, or they want to burn coal, like there's a lot of plants that want to put this technology on coal. And they create a lot of pipelines, and they take those pipelines and they shoot that compressed CO2 underground in a place where it's possible to do that. This, as I said, is a proven technology. We've been doing it since at least the 1980s. And you might wonder, why haven't I heard of this, Hudson? It's a weird thing that we've been doing this and like nobody's talked about it really. Well, next slide, please. We've been doing it, as many people may know, to extract more oil. So this has not been developed because the pipeline and oil industry are great people who like to save the environment. In fact, it's to produce oil out of oil fields that have run dry. By pushing in a lot of CO2, you can get out a lot more barrels of oil. And this is a proven technology that many geologists have devoted their entire careers to. And we know that it works very well for extracting oil. It's less clear that it works very well for permanent carbon storage, but we do know that a bunch of pipes with a bunch of compressed CO2 can certainly push a ton of, or a large amount, ton is a underestimate in this case, of stuff into the ground. So they know it'll work, and that's what they'd like to do here in Minnesota. Next slide, please. So this is the current pipeline network that's proposed by the Summit Carbon Solutions company. They've never built a pipeline before. They're just this new fangled concept to create the largest CO2 pipeline network in the world. And that includes parts of Minnesota. You can see that the end of the road is in North Dakota there, next to the North Dakota oil patch. They currently have said to some people that they intend to permanently sequester it without extracting oil, and they've said to other people that they would certainly bring CO2 to North Dakota to extract more oil. So it depends on whether you believe them on Monday or Tuesday, because they've said both to different audiences. Also, and I think important to our public lands point, I've recently learned from the U.S. USFS, the National Forest folks, that there has been an application in North Dakota to inject carbon dioxide into the Dakota Prairie National Grassland, which is also close to the oil patch. So this is going to be injected potentially under privately held lands, but also potentially under publicly held lands, especially if the Forest Service changes their policy to allow it. Currently, it is not allowed, but they have a rule that they proposed which would change that. Interestingly, Minnesota, you can see from this map, is sort of an afterthought. The real action is in Iowa and South Dakota and necessarily in North Dakota. But keep in mind, this is just the initial proposal by the company to hook up to some ethanol plants. It is not what the eventual build out of this network could be. And for that, next slide, please. This is a general geology map from our friends at the U.S. Geological Survey. And you'll see on the left half of North Dakota, there's that gray spot that is where one could inject CO2 underground. But if you were wondering, can they do that here in Minnesota? No. We do not have the right geology. So this technology that the oil and gas industry likes requires pipelines that would take CO2 out of Minnesota and bring it somewhere else, presumably North Dakota. Illinois or Michigan are the closest ones that it could go to, and that's ignoring Canada. Of course, Canada would be a huge receiver of CO2 if we let them. They have lots of oil to get out. So the green marks on our great state of Minnesota there, we'll get to that at a later section, but right now it's just useful to know that Minnesota cannot use the type of CO2 that the oil and gas industry wants to inject underground. It cannot be injected in Minnesota because we don't have oil and gas deposits the same as these other states. Next slide, please. So that two photos ago, there was just the beginning of the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline network. This is the existing, a simplified version of the existing pipeline network that crosses Minnesota and the rest of the country. You can see we have a lot of pipelines in Minnesota, and once you start building a pipeline network, it doesn't just stop there. It continues to grow. And we can expect that where there are pipelines, they would put a second pipeline, a third pipeline, a seventh or a 10th pipeline next to that in a corridor. Next slide, please. So where could this potential pipeline network build out? Again, ignore the green for now, but all of these dots are existing industrial heavy sources of CO2 pollution in our area. And I've added question marks up around Superior, Wisconsin and down in Southwest Minnesota because both in Superior and in Southwest Minnesota, our energy companies have proposed gigantic new gas-fired power plants. And you can't build a new gas-fired power plant without seriously considering having carbon capture on it because the US EPA under the current administration is pretty clear that they are going to require things like 90% carbon capture on gas plants. So if you're going to build a new one, it's going to have two pipelines, one to bring the gas to it and one to take away the CO2. And currently the Summit Pipeline Network doesn't say it's going to connect to those facilities because they don't exist yet. But I mean, if you build it, they will come is my take on that. Sorry for the busy map, but the dots are everywhere on Minnesota and they indicate places where a build out may be likely. Next slide, please. And then no dots on this one, but this is where our federal public lands and federal Indian reservations are in Minnesota. Most of them are in northern Minnesota. Aiken County and where I live up in Ely are much closer to the federal Indian lands or federal public lands that we have, and also the reservations. And as a result, we know a little bit more. We have a little more experience with pipelines and industry crossing these public lands. Obviously, the rest of Minnesota has state public lands. This is just a map of the federal public lands. But because the Superior National, the Forest Service, which administers these two green areas, has a current proposal to allow carbon capture companies to use their lands permanently, to put on pipelines permanently through national forests. It is relevant here to us, even though currently the Summit Pipeline is not proposed in the northern part of the state. Next slide, please. And folks in Aiken County would know this is a photo of Line 3. Its previous route and the new route for the brand new Line 3 pipeline. On that black line, you can see that was 6 active pipelines. Now it is 5 active pipelines in an abandoned pipeline. The brown line is the new Line 3 route, which has 1 active pipeline, but very soon it could have 6 active pipelines because when you build one pipeline, you create a corridor. Interestingly, I'm just talking about oil and gas pipelines for now. But the same company, Enbridge, who built Line 3, is very bullish about being the pipeline company for the carbon capture industry as well. They have plenty of information about how they want to get into this. And you can bet that if they already have a pipeline corridor, they will use their existing corridor to build more pipelines. And this is where I just mentioned in passing, a CO2 pipeline is very similar to an oil pipeline in that it has the same impacts on groundwater, it has the same impacts on land. it really can negatively impact those things. But it's different as well because the pressure of a carbon dioxide pipeline is so much more than even a natural gas pipeline that it can act in very strange ways. And when it explodes, it can cause pretty remarkable harm to human health and the environment through the off-gassing of large amounts of CO2 displacing air and causing suffocation on large landscape scales. Next slide, please. So as far as that proposal goes for the Summit pipeline, this fall will be your opportunity to get involved if you so choose. There are public meetings on August 20th and 21st, and you can comment through September 11th in the proposed docket for the Summit pipeline before the Public Utilities Commission right now. We are happy to share information with you about that. We'll be organizing folks in person and online and would love to keep you in the loop. So please reach out to me or get hooked up with Cure if you're interested in what the oil and gas industry is proposing for our state. Now, next slide, please, moving on. Industry research. This is where we get to talk about talent a little bit more specifically. So as I said, you were supposed to ignore the green for now, but now let's look at the green. Green here is, I'm going to say this wrong, I always do, mafic rocks, and the orange dots are ultramafic rocks. I am a lawyer, not a geologist, but these are rocks that the U.S. Geological Survey has identified as being useful for carbon capture and sequestration because when they are weathered, they capture CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it to basically dirty water with higher amounts of carbon in it. So these are the potential places where this type of carbon capture could happen in our area. And next slide, please. As you can see, it's very similar, not exactly the same, but similar to our public lands and where tribal areas are. So if you thought that was a coincidence, I don't think it's a coincidence, or at least I'm concerned about the opening of our public lands up to a new heavy industry, especially our lands that are either set aside as wilderness and meant to be protected, or lands that tribes have every right to co-manage, and giving up these lands to a new industry permanently, as the Forest Service seems to be interested in doing, would cut off tribes from their historic and legal rights to manage these lands, which are only starting to become a thing here in Minnesota. Next slide, please. There is one orange dot that those in Aiken County may have noticed on that. It's X'd in this slide, and that's where Talon Metals is. Next slide, please. Talon Metals is in the carbon capture game. They're not yet a mining company. That is to say they haven't done any mining, but they are getting money from both the government and their mining sugar daddy to research the possibility of using Minnesota minerals for carbon capture. So they've received $2.2 million from the Department of Energy to look at doing a new kind of carbon capture. And Rio Tinto has put in $4 million. And this is a 3-year process where they're doing lab studies, field work. Many thanks to Tom Anderson for the information on this. It's a big, complicated thing hard to keep track of, and I appreciate the help. Next slide, please. This type of rock weathering has been done, and Tom did a great presentation on this topic already, so I won't repeat it, but it's being done in Iceland with very large industrial facilities on the landscape in areas that don't have trees and don't really have a whole lot of wildlife. So consider whether what they do in Iceland is exactly what we should do in the north half of the state of Minnesota. I don't know if it is the same thing we should do. Next slide, please. And then the same thing, one interesting thing is like what they're doing in Iceland is not what they're doing in Albania, but they're both doing weathering to do carbon capture and sequestration. So this is a company that I just heard about yesterday or 2 days ago. It's called Metal Plant in Albania, and it has a novel technology combining nickel mining with enhanced rock weathering to produce nickel and CDR. And I think this is interesting to this group particularly. What they're doing is they are farming flowers that naturally uptake a large amount of nickel, and they are drying out those flowers and then using that as a mine. Now, what else they're doing is they're grinding up this type of rock and putting it on their fields so that it can capture CO2, but also it discharges toxic amounts of nickel as a result of doing that. So they are putting the specific type of rock that we also have in Minnesota to some extent on fields. They're soaking it up and they're extracting it without having a mining pit, but they do end up with land pollution in terms of additional nickel, which the flowers are helping them take off. And then, as I said, my understanding as a lawyer, not a geologist, is that the carbon that's captured goes into runoff water. So that ends up, increasing the the carbonic acid, if you will, in runoff water, which is, to some extent, there is carbon in water, but I question whether you want to have an extremely high amount of that in the water running off of your farm field. But it's just a different way of doing it. And weatherization, there's probably hundreds of companies working on different ways to do it. I don't know what Talon Metals has planned, but this is one example of people trying to do it one way. And I'm sure we'll see a different kind of way from our friends at Talon. So I think I maybe have one more slide. So just in conclusion, I want to bring back to the idea that trees do this already and for free. Wetlands do carbon capture, and when we are talking about draining a wetland or cutting down a forest in order to do carbon capture, I think we should think long and hard about whether that's a good idea, because we are already getting ecosystem services from our natural landscapes, and we could do more to help those landscapes to stay healthy and to capture carbon on their own. Or we could cut them up with pipelines, and we could cut down trees, and we could do all these things in order to make some incumbent industries richer with our own taxpayer dollars. It's sort of not as simple as just that dualism, but often it is coming down to that. So the use of national forests for carbon capture industry will require pipeline right-of-ways where there will be no trees. That will fragment habitat. That will have impacts on those who already use these areas. It will negatively impact the logging industry. Our good friends at the logging industry. So everything here is a trade-off, and we need to think about what our values are and what we want to spend our time and money on in terms of actually addressing climate problems with actual solutions.